In a packed Los Angeles television studio, an 84-year-old martial arts legend sat beneath blazing stage lights, moments away from a confrontation he never sought. What began as a harmless celebrity interview turned electric when a revered pastor's ego ignited a cultural firestorm on live TV. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical retired actor. For decades, he'd been a U.S. Air Force veteran turned world karate champion, known for defeating not just opponents, but the arrogance of men who underestimated him. When Bishop T.D. Jakes, carried away by his own spotlight, sneered, "Be quiet, old fart," the audience froze. But the insult did not find its mark. Norris's stillness became his counterstrike, a quiet defiance that unraveled ego with calm precision. His response wasn't revenge, it was revelation. What began as a staged interview became a global reckoning. The studio that sought viral conflict became the cradle of an unexpected redemption. And the world watching, tweeting, gasping, would never see strength, faith, or humility the same way again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The studio lights blaze down on the polished stage of The MJ Show, Legends and Legacy Edition, bathing everything in a warm, inviting glow. The air buzzed with electricity, that unmistakable blend of anticipation and nerves that always preceded a live broadcast. In the control booth, 23-year-old production assistant Cameron Lee adjusted his headset, watching the audience file in through the monitors. Every seat would be filled tonight. This wasn't just another celebrity interview. It was a cultural event. 90 seconds to air, the floor director called, his voice crackling through Cameron's earpiece. Cameron glanced at the green room feed where Maria M.J. Johnson, the show's charismatic host, was making final adjustments to her blazer. At 35, MJ had become one of the most respected interviewers in television, known for drawing out authentic moments from even the most guarded guests. Tonight's pairing, however, was a producer's dream and a host's challenge. Two American icons from completely different worlds. In the left green room, Bishop T.D. Jakes paced, scrolling through his phone. The renowned pastor and media mogul carried himself with the confident air of someone accustomed to commanding attention. At 67, he remained a powerhouse. His voice still capable of filling megachurches, and his words still sparking viral moments across social media. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than Cameron's monthly rent, and his presence seemed to fill the room even on the small monitor. The right green room told a different story. Chuck Norris sat perfectly still, hands resting on his knees. At 84, the martial arts legend and actor had largely retreated from public life, making this rare appearance all the more significant. He wore a simple button-down shirt and slacks, no flash, no statement, just quiet dignity. His legendary beard, now white as snow, framed a face that had aged into wisdom rather than simply grown old. "These guys couldn't be more different," whispered Tara, another PA standing beside Cameron. "Think they'll actually get along?" Cameron shrugged. "Doesn't matter if they do. The contrast is the whole point." 30 seconds, the floor director called. The audience erupted as MJ Johnson strode onto the stage, her wide smile gleaming under the lights. She moved with practiced ease to her mark and waited for the applause to settle. "Good evening, America. Welcome to a very special edition of The MJ Show. Tonight, we bring together two men who have shaped American culture in profoundly different ways." She paused for effect. One through the power of faith and oratory, the other through discipline, action, and an almost mythical toughness. The audience's anticipation was palpable, a low murmur rising like a tide. Please welcome Bishop T.D. Jakes and martial arts legend Chuck Norris. The applause thundered as both men entered from opposite sides of the stage. Jake strode forward with theatrical confidence, waving to the crowd, his smile wide and practiced. He moved like someone who knew the cameras were tracking his every gesture. Chuck walked with measured steps, no waving. Just a small, acknowledging nod to the audience. As they settled into the curved sofa across from MJ's chair, Cameron noticed the body language immediately. Jake spread himself comfortably, one arm extending along the back of the sofa. Chuck sat straight, hands folded in his lap, taking up precisely the space he needed, and not an inch more. "Gentlemen, it's an honor to have you both," MJ began, leaning forward. "Two American treasures who've never shared a stage before. Pleasure to be here," Chuck said. His voice soft, but clear. Jake's nodded enthusiastically. "Always a joy to connect with the people, MJ. And to sit beside a legend." He turned toward Chuck with a broad smile. "Well, that's just God's grace. I'd like to start with the concept of legacy," I said. "Both of you have built extraordinary ones, but in completely different arenas. Bishop Jakes, your words have inspired millions. Mr. Norris, your actions have done the same. How do you hope to be remembered?" Chuck inclined his head slightly, deferring to Jakes to answer first. "Well, MJ," Jakes began, his deep voice resonating across the studio. "Legacy is about impact, isn't it? It's about how many lives you touch, how many people remember your name, and carry your message forward." He gestured expansively. "I've been blessed to reach millions through ministry, through books, through film. But the real legacy isn't the platform, it's the message. The transformation. When I'm long gone, if people still find hope in those words, that's legacy." The audience applauded enthusiastically. Jakes acknowledged it with a practiced nod before turning to Chuck. "What about you, Mr. Norris? Different path? Same destination?" Chuck cleared his throat quietly. "I suppose I see it differently," he said. His voice wasn't weak, but it lacked Jake's practiced projection. The audience leaned forward slightly to catch his words. "Legacy isn't what people say about you. It's the truth of how you lived. Did you stand by your principles? Were you kind when no one was watching?" He paused. "I hope my grandchildren remember me as someone who tried to live with honor. The public stuff, the movies, the reputation, that's just noise." A thoughtful silence settled over the studio. Cameron noticed several audience members nodding slowly, absorbing the contrast. MJ smiled. Two different approaches to a lasting impact. "Bishop Jakes, you've built an empire through your voice, your ability to move people with words. Mr. Norris, you've connected through action, through a physical presence that came to symbolize a certain kind of American strength. Different gifts, same source." Jakes interjected smoothly. "The Lord gives each of us instruments to play in this grand symphony." Chuck nodded politely but said nothing. The interview continued, touching on faith, discipline, and the challenges of public life. Cameron watched the monitors, noticing how the camera operators kept focusing on the contrast between Jakes's expansive gestures and Chuck's measured stillness. It made for compelling television, the preacher and the warrior, the voice and the fist, sharing the same space. But as the segment progressed, something subtle shifted. Jakes began speaking more rapidly, his answers growing longer, occasionally speaking over MJ's follow-up questions. Each time Chuck began to respond, Jakes would interject with, "If I could just add to that," extending his own airtime. In the control booth, the director muttered, "Jakes is dominating. We need to balance this." MJ, sensing the imbalance, redirected. "Chuck, you've been quieter. I'd love to hear more about how your martial arts background shaped your approach to challenges." Chuck leaned forward slightly. The first lesson in martial arts is, and that's really the heart of what I've been saying all along. Jakes interrupted, speaking over Chuck. Challenges are spiritual battles before they're physical ones. You know, in my book, MJ's eyes flashed with professional irritation. Bishop, I'd love to hear Chuck finish his thought. The audience tensed slightly at the correction. Jake smiled, but Cameron could see the momentary flash of displeasure in his eyes. Of course, Jake said, gesturing magnanimously toward Chuck. Please, continue. I'm fascinated by the physical perspective. Something in his tone suggested condescension, a subtle framing of Chuck's wisdom as somehow less profound than his own spiritual insights. A few audience members exchanged glances. Chuck seemed unbothered. As I was saying, the first lesson isn't how to fight. It's when not to. Powerful, Mon said, seizing the moment. Let's take a quick break. And when we return, faith, fame, and finding purpose after the spotlight fades. Stay with us. As the cameras cut to commercial, Cameron watched the monitors closely. MJ leaned forward to say something to both men, probably reminding them about sharing the conversational space. Chuck nodded simply. Jake smiled broadly, placing a hand on MJ's arm as he responded, but Cameron couldn't shake the feeling that beneath the polished surface of the interview, something was building a tension that had nothing to do with faith or martial arts, and everything to do with the oldest struggle in human history: the battle between ego and humility. In the booth, the show's producer spoke into his headset. This is good television. The contrast is working. Let's keep pushing it when we come back. Cameron watched Chuck take a small sip of water, his expression unreadable. The young PA couldn't help but wonder what was happening behind those calm eyes, and what would happen when the cameras started rolling again. We're back in 3, 2. The floor director's voice faded as he pointed to MJ, signaling the return from commercial. MJ's smile beamed toward the camera. Welcome back to our special edition of The MJ Show, where we're joined by Bishop T.D. Jakes and Chuck Norris. She shifted in her chair, recrossing her legs. Before the break, we were discussing legacy and influence. I'd like to pivot slightly to something both of you have in common: longevity in the public eye and adapting to cultural changes. Jakes nodded enthusiastically, already formulating his response. Chuck, MJ continued, deliberately directing the question first. At 84, you've seen enormous cultural shifts. How have you stayed relevant across the decades? Chuck considered this for a moment. I'm not sure I have, he replied with surprising candor. Relevance isn't something I chase. Times change. Trends come and go. I focus on what doesn't change: honor, discipline, faith, family. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the audience. Interesting perspective, MJ said. Bishop Jakes, same question to you. How have you navigated cultural shifts while maintaining your message? Jakes leaned forward energetically. Well, unlike my friend Chuck here, I believe relevance is essential. His voice carried a gentle ribbing tone. The message may be timeless, but the delivery must evolve. My ministry has embraced social media, streaming, new formats because reaching people means speaking their language. He gestured toward Chuck. With all due respect to the legends of yesterday, if you're not evolving, you're just. He paused for effect, a nostalgic memory. The audience reacted with a mixture of ooh and nervous laughter. Cameron winced at the thinly veiled barb. Chuck's expression remained neutral, though something flickered briefly in his eyes. MJ, sensing the tension, attempted to steer the conversation. Both approaches have their merits. Do they, though? Jakes interrupted. his voice carrying a sharper edge now. He turned more fully toward Chuck. I mean, no disrespect to Mr. Norris's contributions, but is reminiscing about the good old days really serving today's generation. They're facing challenges we never imagined. The audience grew quieter, the atmosphere shifting from entertainment to discomfort. Bishop, MJ began, but Jakes was building momentum. Look, I'm just being honest here. There's a reason some voices fade while others grow stronger. He gestured to himself. My congregation gets younger every year because I refuse to be stuck in the past. Meanwhile, he looked pointedly at Chuck. When's the last time you were relevant to anyone under 50? The studio temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. In the control booth, Cameron saw the director lean forward, eyes wide with the realization that this carefully planned segment was veering into uncharted territory. Chuck remained still, his hands folded in his lap. His face betrayed no offense, just a quiet watchfulness. MJ attempted to reclaim control. I think what Bishop Jakes is trying to say. What I'm saying, Jakes continued, riding the wave of tension, is that wisdom requires currency. Chuck's era was spectacular, truly. Those films inspired millions. But wisdom that doesn't update itself becomes. He chuckled. A sound that filled the suddenly quiet studio. Well, it becomes an antique. Interesting to look at, but not particularly useful. Cameron watched in disbelief as Jakes continued what had become an unmistakable dismissal of Chuck's relevance. In the booth, the producer whispered, "Should we cut to commercial?" But the director shook his head, transfixed by the unfolding drama. The problem with legends, Jakes continued, his voice carrying an almost patronizing warmth now, is they don't always know when to pass the torch. They hang around past their time, clinging to what was instead of embracing what is. MJ's professional smile had frozen on her face. I think we should. Be quiet, old fart, Jakes said, the words slipping out in what might have been an attempted joke, but landed like a slap. The adults are talking about relevance now. A collective gasp swept through the audience. Camera operators exchanged shocked glances. MJ's eyes widened in disbelief. Chuck Norris sat perfectly still, his expression unchanged. Bishop Jakes? MJ said sharply, professionalism barely containing her shock. That's completely. Oh, lighten up, Jakes said, with a dismissive wave, trying to recover with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Chuck knows I'm just playing. Don't you, Chuck? He reached over and patted Chuck's knee with forced camaraderie. For 3 excruciating seconds, silence filled the studio. Chuck looked down at Jakes' hand on his knee, then slowly raised his gaze to meet the pastor's eyes. The audience held its collective breath. Even the cameramen seemed frozen, the red recording lights the only movement in the room. In the control booth, Cameron whispered, "Holy shit. Cut to commercial." The director finally ordered, but before the transition could happen, Chuck Norris spoke. I'd like to respond if I may. His voice was quiet but clear, carrying no anger or defensiveness, just a simple request. Something in his tone made even Jakes pause. MJ, relief washing over her face at Chuck's calmness, nodded quickly. Of course, please do. The director's hand hovered over the controls, then retreated. Whatever was coming, it would happen live, unfiltered, in front of millions. Chuck shifted slightly, turning to face Jakes more directly. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. When he finally spoke, his voice remained level, not raised in defense or lowered in shame. You know, he began, when I was younger, I might have responded differently to words like that. The statement hung in the air, carrying the weight of his history. Everyone in the studio knew exactly what the different response might have entailed from a martial arts legend. "But I've learned something over my 84 years, Chuck continued. "True strength isn't in how loudly you can shout or how hard you can hit. It's in knowing when to do neither." Jake's smile remained fixed, but uncertainty had begun to creep into his eyes. "Bishop," Chuck said, the word carrying neither judgment nor condemnation, "I wonder why you felt the need to diminish me to elevate yourself." The simple question, asked without accusation, seemed to pierce the studio atmosphere. Several audience members nodded slowly, the question resonating. "I wasn't," Jakes began. But Chuck continued with gentle persistence. "You speak of relevance as though it's measured in followers or headlines. I've never confused attention with impact." The camera caught Jakes's expression, shifting confidence, giving way to something less certain. "As for being an old fart," Chuck said, the hint of a smile touching his lips, "age is a gift denied to many. Each of these wrinkles represents a lesson learned, often the hard way." He gestured to his lined face. "I've earned every one." The audience, initially shocked into silence, now leaned forward collectively, captivated not by controversy, but by the unexpected depth unfolding before them. Chuck's next words came softer, forcing everyone to listen more carefully. "I don't know what battle you're fighting, Bishop, that requires you to win this conversation so badly. But whatever it is, I'm not your enemy in it." In the control booth, Cameron Lee felt goosebumps rise on his arms. This wasn't the choreographed conflict the producers had hoped for. It was something far more powerful. It was watching wisdom disarm ego, without throwing a single punch. The studio remained suspended in a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the constraints of a television segment. MJ, recognizing the significance of what was unfolding, made no attempt to reclaim control. "Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." Jakes shifted in his seat, the movement betraying his discomfort. His usual eloquence had abandoned him, leaving only the naked reality of his behavior exposed under the studio lights. "We'll take a short break," MJ finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "Please, stay with us." As the broadcast cut to commercial, the studio remained silent. No one moved. The audience sat transfixed, as if breaking the moment would somehow diminish its power. In those quiet seconds before the production team sprang back into action, something profound had happened, not just a viral television moment, but a masterclass in dignity that no one present would soon forget. And in the hushed studio, T.D. Jakes stared at his hands, the echo of his own words, "Be quiet, old fart," hanging in the air like a verdict on himself rather than the man they were meant to diminish. The commercial break created an artificial pause in the broadcast, but within the studio, time seemed suspended in amber. Production assistants who normally bustled about stood frozen at the edges of the set. MJ leaned forward, speaking in hushed tones to both men. But her words didn't carry to the audience or the crew. In the control booth, pandemonium reigned. "Are we keeping this segment or scrapping it?" The director asked the executive producer, who had rushed in during the break. "Are you kidding? This is television gold," the executive producer replied, his eyes gleaming with the unmistakable excitement of unexpected drama. "The clip of that insult and Chuck's response will be everywhere by morning." Cameron stood quietly in the corner, watching the monitors. Unlike his colleagues, he wasn't thinking about ratings or viral potential. He was watching Chuck Norris's hands. Throughout the entire exchange, including the stinging insult, they had remained perfectly still, resting on his knees. No clenching, no fidgeting, no signs of the internal turmoil that must surely be present. The floor director's voice cut through the charged atmosphere. Back in 30 seconds. MJ straightened in her chair, professional mask sliding back into place. Jakes adjusted his tie, a flash of something uncertainty, perhaps even shame crossing his features before his practiced smile returned. Chuck remained as he had been, seemingly untouched by the chaos swirling around him. 3, 2. The silent point. And they were live again. Welcome back to the MJ show. Millimong Grace, Mace from Loner. Millim Race Maces. Maces Races. She turned toward Jakes. Bishop. Would you like to address what happened? Jakes cleared his throat, his usual oratorical confidence momentarily diminished. I think perhaps my attempt at humor crossed a line, he began, the words coming carefully. Television is entertainment, and sometimes in trying to create compelling moments, we can get carried away. The explanation hung in the air, not quite an apology. More a justification wrapped in vague regret. Chuck's expression remained impassive, neither accepting nor rejecting the quasi-apology. Chuck, Majay said, turning toward him. Your response was remarkably measured. Many people might have reacted differently to being called. What you were called on national television. A soft murmur rippled through the audience. The insult still resonated, impossible to ignore, despite Jakes' attempt to smooth it over. Chuck shifted slightly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The studio fell silent, everyone leaning forward, imperceptibly. You know, he began, his voice still carrying that same steady quietness. There's a story I'd like to share, if I may. Mai nodded, relief washing over her features at this lifeline. Please do. Chuck settled back, his posture relaxed, yet dignified. Years ago, I was training a young fighter who had tremendous physical gifts. Fast, strong, technical, everything you'd want. But he had one problem. He paused, the natural storyteller's instinct for timing, evident even in his unassuming delivery. He couldn't stop talking. A knowing chuckle rippled through the audience. During sparring, he'd taunt his opponents. During instruction, he'd interrupt. Always had to have the last word, the cleverest comeback. Chuck's eyes crinkled slightly at the memory. One day, I paired him with an older student, a man in his 60s who'd only been training a few years but had this remarkable presence. The studio was utterly silent now, everyone absorbed in the narrative. The young fighter immediately started, with his usual routine, talking, taunting, showing off. The older man just listened, centered himself, and waited. Chuck's hands finally moved, forming a simple gesture of patience. When they began sparring, something interesting happened. Every time the young man spoke, he created an opening. His own words became his weakness. Cameron watched Jakes from the control booth monitor. The pastor had gone very still, his eyes fixed on Chuck. Eventually, the young fighter grew frustrated with his opponent's silence. Say something, he demanded. And that's when the older man finally spoke. He said just one sentence. I'm listening to what you need. Chuck paused, letting the words settle. That confused the young fighter. What do you mean? He asked. The older man explained. Your words tell me what you need from this fight. You need to prove something. You need attention. You need to feel superior. I don't need any of those things, so I have the advantage. A collective inhale swept through the studio as the parallel to the current situation became clear. The lesson wasn't really about fighting, Chuck continued. It was about recognizing that our words reveal our needs, often needs we ourselves don't recognize. He turned slightly toward Jakes, his movement carrying no accusation, just a simple shift of attention. When someone feels compelled to diminish others, especially publicly, it rarely reveals anything about the person they're attempting to diminish. The implication hung in the air, profound in its gentleness. Chuck hadn't counterattacked, he had offered insight. MJ, sensing the power of the moment, remained silent, allowing it to breathe. Jake sat unnaturally still, the polished facade of the media-savvy preacher cracking just enough to reveal the human beneath. For perhaps the first time in his public career, he appeared genuinely at a loss for words. The audience, sensing the authentic human drama unfolding before them, remained riveted. This wasn't the manufactured conflict of reality television. It was a genuine moment of truth, uncomfortable yet compelling, precisely because of its unscripted nature. In the control booth, the executive producer whispered, "This is why people still watch live television." Cameron nodded silently, unable to tear his eyes from the monitor. He'd started the evening admiring Jake's confidence and command, enjoying the spectacle of his performative charisma. Now he found himself drawn to the quiet dignity of the man the pastor had dismissed as irrelevant. On stage, the silence stretched, not awkward but weighty with meaning. Chuck seemed perfectly comfortable in it, while Jakes appeared increasingly uncomfortable, shifting slightly in his seat. Finally, MJ spoke. "Bishop Jakes, would you like to respond to Chuck's story?" Jakes smoothed his tie, buying a moment to compose himself. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its projection, becoming more natural, less performed. "That's a powerful perspective," he acknowledged. "Perhaps I have been overly focused on creating a moment rather than having a conversation." It wasn't a full admission, but it was a step back from the brink, a recognition, however slight, that something had gone awry. Chuck acknowledged this with a small nod, neither demanding more nor dismissing what was offered. "I think," Maine said, recognizing an opportunity to steer the conversation back to safer ground, "this touches on something profound about both your journeys. The balance between speaking and listening, between projecting outward and reflecting inward." "Yes," Jake said, seizing the lifeline. "In ministry, we often talk about the importance of both proclamation and contemplation. And in martial arts," Chuck added, "we speak of action and stillness, each valuable in its proper time." The conversation began to flow again, the immediate crisis seemingly averted. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the studio's atmosphere. The audience, having witnessed Jakes' casual cruelty and Chuck's measured response, now watched the pastor through different eyes. His charisma, so effective before, now seemed somewhat hollow, while Chuck's quiet presence had gained gravity. As the segment continued, Jake spoke with slightly less certainty, his trademark confidence dimmed. Chuck remained as he had been, authentic, measured, present. The contrast between them had only grown sharper, but not in the way anyone had anticipated. In the control booth, Cameron watched as the social media feeds began to explode with reactions. The hashtag number #BeQuietOldFart was trending, but not in celebration of Jake's quip. Instead, posts expressed shock, disappointment, and growing respect for Chuck's dignity under fire. "We should probably start monitoring the fallout," the social media coordinator murmured, scrolling through her phone. "This is going to be everywhere by morning." The executive producer nodded absently, his attention fixed on the monitors. "Stay on Chuck's face," he instructed the camera operators through his headset. "Every reaction, every micro expression. This is the story now." As the segment wound toward its conclusion, MJ expertly guided the conversation toward less contentious waters, discussing charitable work, family values, and future projects. On the surface, professional cordiality had been restored. Yet beneath this veneer, everyone from the studio audience to the millions watching at home knew they had witnessed something rare in the landscape of contemporary media. A genuine moment of character revealed, not through careful curation, but through unexpected pressure. And as the floor director signaled the approaching commercial break, the storm that had briefly threatened now seemed to have passed. But like all momentary calms, this one carried its own tension. The unspoken recognition that something significant remained unresolved, and that the true impact of what had transpired was yet to be fully understood. We'll be right back with more from Bishop T.D. Jakes and Chuck Norris, Maya announced as the cameras prepared to cut away. Stay with us. As the red lights dimmed, signaling they were off air, Chuck reached for his water glass. His hand, Cameron noticed, was perfectly steady. When the broadcast resumed, something had shifted in the studio's atmospheric pressure. The audience sat forward in their seats, no longer merely entertained but emotionally invested in the unfolding human drama. Social media was already ablaze with clips of the previous segment, the insult, Chuck's measured response, and the uncomfortable aftermath. MJ leaned forward, her professional demeanor infused with a new seriousness. Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with Bishop T.D. Jakes and Chuck Norris. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Before we move on, I think it's important to acknowledge that our discussion has taken some unexpected turns tonight. Jakes nodded, attempting to reclaim his usual authoritative presence. Television is unpredictable, Majay. That's what makes it exciting. The smile that had charmed millions for decades appeared, but it seemed somehow less effective under the studio lights. Chuck, I said, turning toward the martial arts legend, I'd like to return to something you touched on earlier, the relationship between words and strength. Throughout your career, you've been known for letting your actions speak louder than your words. Was that a conscious choice? Chuck adjusted his position slightly, his movements economical and deliberate. It wasn't something I philosophized about, he replied, his voice carrying that same unhurried calm. It was practical. In martial arts, excessive talking wastes energy and telegraphs your intentions. A small smile touched his lips. My instructor used to say, a mouth that's open isn't ready to strike or defend. A ripple of appreciation moved through the audience. But beyond the practical, Chuck continued, I discovered something important over time. The more secure I became in who I was, the less I needed others to acknowledge it. The words landed with quiet force. Several audience members nodded in recognition. Jakes shifted in his seat, the movement betraying his discomfort with this line of discussion. Although, he interjected, there's biblical precedent for the power of proclamation. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, he quoted. Sometimes speaking truth boldly is exactly what's needed. I agree, Chuck replied, surprising everyone with his immediate concurrence. Words have tremendous power, which is precisely why they require such care. The simple statement hung in the air, its implication unmistakable in the context of what had transpired earlier. MJ, sensing the renewed tension, attempted to broaden the conversation. Both of you have spent decades in the public eye. How do you handle criticism, or as we witnessed earlier, outright insults? Jake straightened, seizing the familiar territory. Criticism comes with the platform, he said, his voice regaining some of its stentorian quality. When you're reaching millions, not everyone will appreciate your message or your methods. I've learned to distinguish between criticism that's constructive and attacks that are merely destructive. He gestured expansively. As leaders, we must have thick skin. People project their own issues onto public figures. Understanding that helps me respond with compassion rather than defensiveness. The irony of his statement, given the evening's events, wasn't lost on the audience. Several exchanged glances, the disconnect between Jakes' words and his actions palpable. Chuck? MJ prompted, turning to the quieter presence on her stage. Chuck nodded thoughtfully. I've found that most criticism contains at least a kernel of truth, even when it's poorly delivered. He paused. The challenge is to find that kernel without being distracted by the delivery. And what about tonight? MJ asked. The question direct yet gentle. The comment directed at you was quite harsh. A hush fell over the studio. Cameron, watching from the control booth, held his breath along with everyone else. This was the moment, the direct acknowledgement of the elephant in the room. Chuck's expression remained composed, but his eyes carried a new intensity. You know, he began, his voice quieter now, forcing everyone to lean in. There's something I've observed over my 84 years. The people most concerned with appearing strong are often carrying the heaviest burdens of insecurity. The words landed with precision, like a master martial artist finding exactly the right pressure point. I've known many truly powerful men and women. Chuck continued. True power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to diminish others to be recognized. Jake sat perfectly still, his media-trained smile frozen in place as Chuck spoke. When Bishop Jakes suggested I was irrelevant, an old fart who should be quiet, I wasn't offended. Chuck's hands rested calmly on his knees. I was curious. Curious? MJ echoed, clearly intrigued. Yes. Chuck nodded. Curious about what would make a man of God, a spiritual leader, with tremendous gifts, feel the need to publicly diminish someone who posed no threat to him. The audience was utterly silent now, hanging on every word. This wasn't the bombastic confrontation of reality TV, but something far more compelling, a masterclass in emotional intelligence delivered without raising his voice. I don't claim to know what Bishop Jakes is carrying tonight. Chuck continued, his tone free of accusation. But I recognized the behavior immediately. I've seen it in fighters before, big matches, the need to talk down their opponents, to convince themselves of their superiority. He turned slightly toward Jakes, his expression not angry but genuinely concerned. It usually comes from fear. The word fear seemed to echo in the silent studio. Jakes's composure slipped visibly, his practiced facade cracking under the gentle precision of Chuck's insight. I don't, Jakes began, then stopped. For perhaps the first time in his public career, the eloquent preacher found himself at a loss for words. Chuck continued, his voice carrying an unexpected compassion. Bishop, your words didn't define me, they revealed something about you. And whatever battle you're fighting that made those words necessary, I sincerely hope you find peace in it. In the control booth, Cameron felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't a counterattack, it was something far more powerful. It was grace. MJ, recognizing the profound weight of the moment, allowed the silence to stretch, giving space for the impact to register with everyone present. When Jakes finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the performative resonance, the practiced cadence that had filled stadiums. In its place was something smaller, more human. I apologize, Mr. Norris. You're right. He swallowed visibly. My comment was unnecessary and unkind. The admission seemed wrenched from somewhere deep, costly, in a way that his usual polished statements never were. Chuck nodded once, accepting the apology without needing to underline the victory. You know, Chuck said after a moment, his tone lightening slightly. When I was a young man competing in tournaments, I was full of fire and pride. I wanted everyone to know how tough I was. A small, self-deprecating smile touched his lips. I learned the hard way that real strength isn't about dominating others, it's about mastering yourself. The audience released a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The tension that had built to an almost unbearable level began to dissipate. Not through avoidance, but through genuine resolution. There's a verse I've always found meaningful, Chuck continued, his voice gentle. A soft answer turneth away wrath. I've found that to be true not just in scripture, but in life. He glanced at Jakes, with no triumph, only understanding. Sometimes the strongest response is the quietest one. The audience sat in reverent silence, witnessing something rarely seen on television. Authentic human growth unfolding in real time. MJ, a veteran of thousands of interviews, recognized the significance of the moment. Bishop Jakes, you've spoken and written extensively about humility. What are your thoughts now, having experienced this exchange? Jakes took a deep breath, visibly centering himself. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new quality, less performative, more genuine. Humility has always been easier to preach than to practice. A murmur of recognition rippled through the audience. I've stood before millions and spoken about ego, about pride, about the danger of forgetting our humanity. He turned toward Chuck, meeting his eyes directly for perhaps the first time. And yet tonight, I became exactly what I've cautioned others against, someone so concerned with being seen as powerful that I diminished another person to elevate myself. The admission seemed to cost him something precious, the carefully constructed image of perfection that public figures often hide behind. Mr. Norris, he continued, the formal address itself an acknowledgement. Your response to my unacceptable comment wasn't just gracious. It was instructive. He shook his head slightly. You demonstrated the very strength I was claiming for myself. Chuck remained still, neither rejecting the acknowledgement nor basking in it. You know, Jakes continued, something new entering his voice, a vulnerability rarely displayed on his global platforms. Before coming on stage tonight, I received some difficult news. He paused, clearly weighing how much to share. My most recent book. The sales figures came in well below expectations. The publisher is questioning our contract for the next 3. A ripple of surprise moved through the studio. This wasn't the kind of personal admission typically shared on national television, especially by someone known for projecting unwavering success. I've built an identity around relevance, around influence. Jakes continued. When those numbers hit my phone right before walking on stage, I think I needed to prove something. And you, he nodded toward Chuck, with your quiet confidence, became the target. Chuck nodded slowly. Fear often wears the mask of aggression, he said. Not as a judgment, but as a simple observation. Exactly that, Jakes agreed, a genuine smile finally breaking through the practiced one. You know, in all my years of ministry, I've found it far easier to offer wisdom than to receive it. He turned toward the audience. Perhaps that's tonight's lesson for all of us. Humility isn't just about how we speak about ourselves, it's about how genuinely willing we are to learn from others. The studio audience responded with the first authentic applause of the evening, not the obligatory response to celebrity, but recognition of something true. MJ, sensing the powerful turn in the conversation, leaned forward. Chuck, throughout this unexpected exchange, you've maintained remarkable composure. Where does that come from? Is it martial arts training, life experience, faith? Chuck considered this for a moment. All of those, I suppose. But mainly, it's understanding that reactions are choices. His weathered hands rested comfortably on his knees. When someone directs anger or insults toward you, they're offering a gift, the opportunity to demonstrate who you truly are. A young woman in the front row visibly wiped away a tear. I could have responded with anger. Chuck continued. 50 years ago, I might have. The hint of a smile touched his eyes. But what would that have proven? That I could dominate another person? That my ego needed defending? He shook his head. Those aren't strengths. They're weaknesses dressed up as strength. That's profound, MJ said softly. Not really, Chuck replied, with characteristic modesty. It's something most of us learn if we live long enough. True power rarely announces itself. He glanced at Jakes without judgment. The louder someone proclaims their strength, the more I wonder what they're afraid of. The truth of the statement seemed to resonate through the studio like a bell tone. In the control booth, Cameron noticed several crew members nodding in recognition. Jake sat straighter, something new entering his expression, not defensiveness but genuine curiosity. How do you maintain that center, though? In a world that constantly demands we prove our relevance, our worth. It was the first question he'd asked all evening that wasn't performative, a genuine seeking of wisdom rather than an opportunity to showcase his own. By remembering what truly matters, Chuck answered simply. At 84, I've buried friends, faced my own mortality, seen fame come and go. None of that the applause, the recognition, the trending hashtags, none of it accompanies you in your final moments. He gestured toward the audience, his movement encompassing not just those physically present, but the millions watching. What remains is how you treated people. Whether you lifted others up or pushed them down, to elevate yourself. Whether you left the world slightly better than you found it. The studio was utterly silent. Every person present absorbed in the unexpected depth of the conversation. What had begun as entertainment had transformed into something approaching wisdom. You know, Chuck continued, his voice carrying a hint of gentle amusement, being called an old fart on national television isn't the worst thing that's happened to me. A ripple of laughter broke the tension. When you've lived through war, lost loved ones, faced your own failures, a moment of disrespect puts things in perspective. He turned toward Jakes, his expression carrying no accusation, only understanding. The question isn't whether someone disrespects you that's going to happen in any life worth living. The question is, what you do with that moment. Does it diminish you, or does it reveal something stronger within you than you might have discovered otherwise? MJ, recognizing the profound turn the conversation had taken, allowed the silence that followed to linger, not an awkward pause, but a space for contemplation. In the control booth, the executive producer whispered, "This isn't what we planned, but it's 1,000 times better." Cameron nodded, unable to tear his eyes from the monitor. What had begun as a cynical attempt to generate viral conflict had become something he'd never witnessed in his 2 years working in television. Authentic human connection, unfolding without artifice. On stage, Jakes appeared to be processing Chuck's words, his usual rapid-fire responses replaced by thoughtful consideration. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a new quality, humbler, more measured. "I've spent my career speaking about transformation," he said. "Yet here I am, being transformed in real time, on national television." He shook his head slightly, a rueful smile touching his lips. "God has a sense of humor." Chuck's eyes crinkled at that. "Indeed he does. You know," Jakes continued, "in ministry, we often talk about iron sharpening iron. The biblical concept that growth comes through challenging encounters with others." He glanced at Chuck. "I came to this show thinking I might dispense some wisdom. Instead, I'm receiving it." The admission, so contrary to the carefully curated image of the all-knowing spiritual leader, seemed to humanize him instantly. Several audience members leaned forward, sensing the authenticity of the moment. "Perhaps," Jakes continued, "that's the most powerful lesson here. Regardless of our age, our accomplishments, our platform, we never outgrow the need to learn, to be humbled, to be reminded of our own humanity. Chuck nodded slowly. The day we think we have nothing left to learn is the day we truly become irrelevant. The statement hung in the air, its gentle callback to the earlier insult transformed now into shared wisdom. MJ, recognizing they had reached the natural conclusion of the segment, turned toward the camera. We'll take a short break, and when we return, we'll open up for some audience questions. Please, stay with us. As the red lights dimmed, signaling they were off air, something unprecedented happened. Bishop T.D. Jakes extended his hand to Chuck Norris, not the performative gesture of television camaraderie, but a genuine offering. Chuck took it without hesitation, the two men's eyes meeting in silent understanding. In that moment, witnessed only by those physically present in the studio, something more powerful than any scripted television moment transpired. The quiet acknowledgement between two human beings that beneath the personas, the reputations, the carefully constructed public images, existed the same fundamental humanity, flawed, vulnerable, and capable of growth. And in the control booth, watching this unscripted moment of connection, Cameron Lee made a private promise to himself about the kind of media he wanted to create in his own career, not the manufactured conflict designed to generate clicks, but authentic moments of human truth that reminded viewers of their better selves. By 3 a.m., the clip had been viewed 17 million times. Cameron Lee sat alone in his apartment, scrolling through social media with bleary eyes, watching the digital aftershocks of what they were now calling the quiet knockout. Every platform was ablaze with commentary, analysis, memes, and emotional responses to the exchange between T.D. Jakes and Chuck Norris. The narrative had crystallized with remarkable speed. Jakes, once universally revered as a spiritual leader, was being recast as an embodiment of ego-driven modern culture, performative, insecure, prioritizing appearance over substance. Chuck Norris, whose presence in public life had diminished in recent years, was experiencing an unexpected renaissance, hailed as a symbol of dignified restraint in an age of knee-jerk reactions and escalation. Cameron's phone buzzed with a text from Tara, his fellow PA. "Can't sleep either? This thing is everywhere." He typed back. "Never seen anything like it. People are treating it like some kind of religious experience." She replied immediately. "Because it was. When's the last time you saw someone handle public humiliation with that much grace? We're all starved for it." Cameron couldn't argue with that assessment. In a media landscape dominated by outrage and performative conflict, Chuck's response had landed like water in a desert, not because it was flashy, but precisely because it wasn't. His Twitter feed continued to update with fresh takes. "That silence was louder than any sermon I've ever heard." Number, "Be quiet, old fart." Watch this 10 times. Notice how Chuck never raises his voice, never attacks back, just offers insight. That's strength. Bishop Jake's been preaching humility for decades, but Chuck Norris just showed it to millions in 2 minutes. The hashtag number, "Be quiet, old fart," had been repurposed from mockery, admiration, with thousands sharing stories of elderly mentors, grandparents, and teachers whose quiet wisdom had shaped their lives. What had begun as an insult had transformed into a cultural touchstone overnight, a shorthand for dignity under fire. Cameron's screen flashed with a notification. The network had released viewing figures. 9.2 million live viewers, their highest rating in 5 years. The YouTube clip had already surpassed 20 million views and was climbing by the minute. He set down his phone, rubbing his tired eyes. Tomorrow, technically later today, he was due back at the studio for the morning debrief. The executives would be ecstatic about the numbers, already strategizing how to capitalize on the unexpected viral moment. But something about that approach felt wrong. cheapening what had transpired. What they had witnessed wasn't content to be monetized. It was a genuine human moment that had accidentally been captured on camera. Cameron's phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from MJ Johnson herself, sent to the entire production team. In 15 years of broadcasting, I've never experienced anything like tonight. What began as entertainment became something far more significant. I'm still processing what we witnessed, but I know this. It was a privilege to be present for it. Thank you all for your professionalism during an unpredictable broadcast. Get some rest, tomorrow we'll be busy. MJ. As Cameron finally drifted toward sleep, images from the evening replayed in his mind. Chuck's steady hands during the insult, Jake's facade cracking under the weight of genuine self-reflection. The audience's shift from entertained spectators to moved participants. Something consequential had happened, though he couldn't yet articulate what. The morning brought chaos to the studio. News vans lined the street outside, reporters angling for exclusive comments from anyone associated with the production. Network executives huddled in conference rooms. Marketing teams scrambled to capitalize on the unexpected cultural moment. And social media managers tracked the still exploding online response. Cameron moved through this frenzy with a strange sense of detachment. While everyone around him spoke of ratings, engagement metrics, and promotional opportunities, his mind remained fixed on the genuine human exchange. He had witnessed something that felt cheapened by the commercial apparatus now swarming around it. In the main conference room, the executive producer addressed the gathered team, his face flushed with excitement. People, we've created a cultural moment here. The clip has 40 million views across platforms. Every major news outlet is covering it. We've already had calls from Good Morning America. Today, CNN, Everyone Wants MJ, and our perspective on what happened. The room buzzed with excitement. Careers were made on moments like this. The network is fast-tracking a special. The wisdom of age. What we can learn from our elders. They want to capitalize on the Chuck Norris angle while it's hot. We're talking expanded format, primetime slot. Excuse me. A quiet voice interrupted from the doorway. The room fell silent as MJ Johnson entered, still carrying the gravitas that had made her broadcast performance so compelling. She moved to the front of the room, her expression thoughtful. I understand the excitement, she began, her tone measured. Last night exceeded everyone's expectations. But before we rush to package and monetize what happened, I think we need to reflect on why it resonated so deeply. She leaned against the conference table, surveying the room. People aren't sharing that clip because it's sensational or shocking. They're sharing it because it's authentic. In a media landscape full of manufactured outrage and performative conflict, they witnessed something genuine, a real human moment that reminded them of values we all aspire to, but rarely see demonstrated. The executive producer shifted uncomfortably. Of course, MJ. And we want to honor that by commodifying it? She asked. Her question gentle but pointed. By creating knockoff segments trying to recapture the magic? By booking guests we hope will insult each other so we can manufacture another viral moment? Uncomfortable silence fell over the room. I've been in this business a long time. MJ continued. I know how the machine works. But I'm asking us all to consider a different approach. What if, instead of trying to replicate what happened, we learn from it? What if we create space for more authentic interactions, rather than engineered confrontations? From his position near the back of the room, Cameron watched faces around him register surprise, consideration, and in some cases, uncomfortable recognition of their own cynicism. I've spoken with both Bishop Jakes and Chuck this morning, MJ said. Both have declined all media appearances. Chuck, in particular, said something I think we should all consider. He said, the moment spoke for itself. Adding commentary would only dilute it. She straightened, addressing the room with quiet authority. I'm recommending we take the same approach. No special, no behind-the-scenes tell, no attempt to recreate the magic with different guests. Instead, let's allow what happened to stand on its own merits and influence how we approach future broadcasts. The silence that followed wasn't entirely comfortable. The executive producer's expression suggested he was mentally calculating the revenue being left on the table. At least consider it, MJ said, moving toward the door. I'll be in my office if anyone wants to discuss further. As she left, the room erupted in murmured conversations. Cameron slipped out, following MJ down the hallway. MJ, he called, catching up to her. Thank you for saying that. She turned, studying him with curious eyes. You're Cameron, right? One of the PAs? Yes, I felt the same way. Like trying to monetize what happened would cheapen it somehow. She smiled slightly. Interesting. Most people at your career stage would be excited about the opportunities this kind of viral moment creates. Cameron shook his head. I came into this industry wanting to create meaningful content. Last night was the first time I've actually witnessed that happening, and it wasn't because of clever production or engineered drama. It was because something authentic broke through all the artifice. MJ studied him thoughtfully. You know, I received an interesting email this morning from Bishop Jakes. Cameron raised his eyebrows, surprised. What did he say? He asked for Chuck Norris's contact information, said he wanted to continue their conversation privately, away from cameras and audiences. She smiled. That, to me, suggests something genuine happened last night, something that transcended the show itself. Cameron nodded. I think millions of people sense that too. That's why they're responding so strongly. Exactly. MJ glanced at her watch. I have a call with the network president in 10 minutes to make my case against exploitation. Wish me luck. Good luck, Cameron said. For what it's worth, I think you're right. She smiled again. Thanks. Sometimes in this business, it helps to be reminded there are still people who value substance over spectacle. As MJ continued down the hallway, Cameron's phone buzzed with a notification. Opening it, he saw a new tweet going viral from TD Jakes' official account. It was simple. Just 5 words. Learning humility in real time. Attached was a photo. Jakes sitting alone in what appeared to be his study, an open Bible before him, his expression thoughtful and subdued. No performative smile, no carefully crafted image, just a man engaged in quiet reflection. The comments section overflowed with reactions, many expressing surprise at the pastor's vulnerability, but one comment in particular caught Cameron's eye. This is what real strength looks like. Admitting when you're wrong and growing from it. Thank you for modeling this for us, Bishop. Cameron closed the app, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Perhaps, he reflected, the most significant impact of the quiet knockout wasn't the viral moment itself, but the ripples it was creating in Jakes' life, in the audience's perceptions, and even in the cynical world of television production. As he headed back toward the conference room, Cameron made a decision. Whatever path his career took from here, he would prioritize authenticity over artifice, substance over spectacle. In a world dominated by noise and performance, he would seek the quiet power of genuine human connection. It wouldn't be the easiest path in modern media, but as Chuck Norris had demonstrated so powerfully, the most meaningful impact often came not from shouting the loudest, but from standing firmly in one's truth. And sometimes, that truth spoke most eloquently through silence. 3 weeks later, Cameron found himself back in the control booth, headset in place, monitoring the feeds with nervous anticipation. The studio hummed with pre-broadcast energy, but something felt different this time, a subtle shift in atmosphere that everyone seemed to sense. 2 minutes to air, the floor director called. On the main monitor, MJ Johnson made final adjustments to her appearance. The set had been reconfigured for tonight's special broadcast. Gone were the flashy graphics and dynamic lighting. In their place was a more subdued setting. 3 simple chairs arranged in a conversational triangle. Warm lighting that emphasized faces rather than spectacle. No studio audience present. "You ready for this?" Tara asked, adjusting sound levels beside him. Cameron nodded. "Still can't believe they agreed to it. After what happened last time, I think they both felt they had unfinished business." The monitors showed both guests in their respective green rooms. Bishop T.D. Jakes sat alone, no phone in hand, no entourage surrounding him. He wore a simple dark suit, elegant, but significantly less ostentatious than his usual public attire. His expression was thoughtful, almost meditative. The second green room showed Chuck Norris. His posture relaxed, yet dignified. He appeared almost identical to his previous appearance, the only difference being the small, leather-bound book resting on his knee. 30 seconds, called the floor director. This broadcast would be different from any in the show's history. No studio audience, no social media integration, no elaborate introduction. Just 3 people engaged in conversation. The idea had been MJ's. Pitched directly to the network president after their viral moment. Rather than attempting to replicate the drama of the previous encounter, she had proposed something radical in modern television. A thoughtful, unrushed conversation about humility, age, wisdom, and the public personas we construct. No artificial time constraints, no commercial interruptions, no performative conflict, just authentic dialogue. To everyone's surprise, the network had agreed. 3, 2. The floor director's silent point. And they were live. "Good evening," MJ began, her voice carrying a gentle gravity. 3 weeks ago, on this program, something unexpected happened. What began as a standard celebrity interview transformed into a moment that has since been viewed by over 70 million people worldwide. The camera pulled back, revealing the simple set. Tonight, by mutual agreement, Bishop T.D. Jakes and Chuck Norris have returned not to rehash what happened, but to continue a conversation that began unexpectedly and deserves the space to develop fully. No dramatic entrance music accompanied them as they walked onto the set from opposite sides. They simply entered, acknowledged MJ with respectful nods, and took their seats. "Thank you both for agreeing to this conversation," MJ said. "I know neither of you has made any public statements about what transpired during our previous broadcast." Jakes nodded, his typical animated energy notably subdued. "Some experiences require reflection before commentary," he said, his voice more measured, less performative. "I've spent these weeks in prayer, in honest self-examination." He turned toward Chuck. "And, in anticipation of tonight, I've had the privilege of several private conversations with Mr. Norris, away from cameras and public scrutiny." This revelation surprised even Cameron. The 2 men had been meeting privately, outside the framework of the broadcast. "Chuck," MJ said, "what have these weeks been like for you?" "Busier than I expected," he said with the hint of a smile. "My grandchildren have been showing me the internet's response. Apparently, I'm what they call trending." A gentle chuckle moved through the small crew. "But beyond that," Chuck continued, "I've been thinking about why that moment resonated so deeply with so many people. What need it fulfilled in our current culture?" "And what conclusions have you reached?" MJ asked. I believe people are hungry for authenticity, Chuck replied simply. In a world where so much is performance, where conflicts escalate instantly, where the loudest voice often dominates, a moment of genuine human connection stands out like water in a desert. Jakes nodded slowly. I've come to a similar conclusion, though it cost me more to reach it. He straightened slightly. For decades, I've built a ministry and a media presence around a certain image, the authoritative voice, the charismatic leader, the person with answers. His hands, usually animated during speech, rested quietly in his lap. What happened between us 3 weeks ago forced me to confront something uncomfortable. How much of that image was authentic service, and how much was ego masquerading as leadership? Chuck regarded Jakes with evident respect. Recognizing that distinction requires rare courage, he said quietly. Perhaps, Jakes acknowledged. But it also requires the mirror that others provide. He looked directly at Chuck. Your response to my unacceptable comment showed me something I needed to see in myself. Not through condemnation, but through contrast. Mai allowed the exchange to unfold naturally, recognizing that her role tonight was not to direct, but to hold space for something authentic to emerge. You know, Jakes continued, I've received thousands of messages since that broadcast. Many expressing disappointment, some offering support. But the ones that affected me most deeply were from young pastors and leaders who said they recognized themselves in my behavior, the need to perform, to dominate, to be seen as authoritative at all costs. He shook his head slowly. I realized I wasn't just failing personally in that moment. I was modeling something harmful for those who looked to me, for example. And yet, Chuck observed, your public acknowledgement of that failure may ultimately prove more instructive than years of polished sermons. Jakes considered this. There's a verse in Proverbs that has been much on my mind. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. I've preached on that text many times, warned against the dangers of pride, spoken about the virtue of humility. A rueful smile touched his lips. And then, in a moment of insecurity, I demonstrated exactly the pride I had cautioned others against. We all fall short of our ideals, Chuck said gently. Indeed we do, Jakes agreed. But when those failings happen publicly, when they affect others, when they contradict the very values we claim to embody, they require more than private regret. They require public acknowledgement and genuine change. He turned more fully toward Chuck. Which is why I want to say, clearly and without qualification, I am deeply sorry for my words and behavior toward you. They were beneath the values I claim to represent, beneath the office I hold, beneath the basic respect one human being owes another. The apology carried a weight and sincerity absent from his earlier, more qualified expression of regret. This wasn't damage control or image management, it was genuine contrition. Chuck nodded once, accepting the apology with simple dignity. Thank you, Bishop. I accept your apology completely. A weight seemed to lift from Jakes's shoulders. In our private conversations these past weeks, you've shown me the same grace you displayed on camera, and it has been transformative. That transformation is evident, MJ observed. There's a different quality to your presence tonight, a centeredness that feels distinct from the public persona many associate with you. Jakes nodded slowly. I've built a career on bold proclamation, on having answers, on certainty, on spiritual authority. There's value in that approach, but also danger. He glanced at Chuck. These weeks have reminded me of the equal importance of listening, of silence, of the humility to recognize that wisdom often comes from unexpected sources. Chuck smiled slightly. Even from old farts? The gentle callback to the insult now transformed into a moment of shared understanding, broke the tension. Jakes laughed, not the performative chuckle of his public persona, but a genuine expression of mirth. Especially from them, he acknowledged. In African traditions, elders are revered precisely because they've outlived their ego's demands. They've survived long enough to distinguish between what matters and what doesn't. He gestured to Chuck. When I called you irrelevant, I was revealing my own shallow definition of relevance, equating it with trending topics, with viral moments, with cultural currency. A thoughtful expression crossed his face. True relevance isn't measured in retweets or viewing figures. It's in living authentically, in modeling values that transcend temporary cultural fixations. Chuck reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, worn notebook. If I may, he said, there's something I've carried with me for decades. Words from my first martial arts instructor that shaped my understanding of true strength. He opened the notebook to a marked page. The oak tree stands tall and proud until the storm breaks it. The reed bends with the wind and survives to stand another day. He looked up from the page. Humility isn't weakness disguised as virtue. It's the practical wisdom to recognize our limitations, to bend rather than break when life tests us. I've spent a lifetime trying to be the oak, Jakes admitted, standing tall, unmoved, projecting strength and certainty. A rueful smile touched his lips. And then, in a moment of insecurity, I broke, revealing that the strength was more performance than reality. Yet here you are, Chuck observed, growing from that breaking. Because you offered grace rather than condemnation, Jakes replied. When I gave you every reason to respond with righteous anger, you chose something higher. He turned toward the camera, addressing the viewing audience directly for the first time. That's the lesson I hope people take from this exchange. Not my failure, but Chuck's example. Not the insult, but the response. MJ, sensing they had reached a natural transition point, leaned forward slightly. Bishop Jakes, you mentioned earlier that you've been hearing from many young leaders who recognize themselves in what happened. If you could speak directly to them now, what would you say? Jakes considered this carefully. I would say that true leadership begins with genuine humility, not as a performance or a strategic posture, but as an honest recognition of our humanity. He gestured to Chuck. I would point to this man's example, not just his response to my insult, but the lifetime of choices that made that response possible. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. And I would say this. The world doesn't need more polished performers. It needs authentic humans willing to acknowledge their flaws, to learn publicly, to model growth rather than perfection. A smile touched his lips. In short, it needs fewer oaks and more reeds. People flexible enough to bend without breaking, secure enough to listen when others speak, humble enough to acknowledge when they're wrong. Chuck nodded slowly. Well said, Bishop. TD, please, Jakes replied with a genuine smile. After these weeks of conversation, I think we've moved beyond formalities. The simple exchange, a shift from title to first name, carried symbolic weight beyond the words themselves. It represented the transition from public personas to authentic connection, from performance to relationship. As the broadcast concluded, there was no dramatic ending, no performative embrace for the cameras. Just three individuals who had engaged in genuine dialogue, each visibly affected by the exchange. As Chuck and Jakes rose from their chairs, shaking hands with quiet dignity, Cameron noticed something that the cameras didn't capture. Chuck reached into his pocket and handed something to Jakes, a small object that passed between them privately, away from the camera's focus. Whatever it was, Jakes received it with evident emotion, nodding in silent acknowledgement. Some moments, Cameron reflected, weren't meant for public consumption, even in the most public of forums. 3 months later, a small gathering assembled in the community room of a modest retirement center on the outskirts of Los Angeles. No cameras recorded the event. No social media announced it. Yet the room buzzed with quiet energy as Bishop T.D. Jakes, dressed in simple attire, rather than his customary suits, stood beside Chuck Norris. Before them sat about 30 elderly residents, their weathered faces attentive as Jakes spoke. "I want to thank you all for allowing us to be here today," he began, his voice carrying none of the performative quality that had characterized his public speaking for decades. "What Chuck and I are doing might seem unusual, a pastor and a martial artist traveling together to speak with elders in communities across the country." He smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. But it grew out of something unexpected. A moment of disrespect transformed into an opportunity for growth and connection. Chuck stood beside him, his posture relaxed, yet dignified. "The bishop and I are here today not to lecture or perform," he explained, "but to listen, to hear your stories, your wisdom, your perspectives that come from decades of lived experience." Jakes nodded. "We call this project the Wisdom of Age. Not because we have wisdom to dispense, but because we believe that in our youth-obsessed culture, the voices of elders are too often dismissed, something I myself was guilty of in a very public way." An elderly woman in the front row raised her hand. "I saw that moment on television," she said. "Everyone was sharing it online." Jakes nodded, a rueful smile touching his lips. "My lowest professional moment became my most viewed," he acknowledged. "But what people witnessed wasn't just my failure, it was Chuck's extraordinary grace. And that's really what this project is about. How do we extend grace to one another across the divides that separate us: age, background, belief?" At the edge of the room, Cameron observed quietly. He had joined MJ's new production company as part of a small team documenting the Wisdom of Age project. Not for broadcast, but for an archive that would preserve these conversations for future generations. "Remarkable, isn't it?" MJ said softly, joining him. "How something authentic emerges when you remove the performance aspect." Cameron nodded. "I keep thinking about that moment 3 months ago, the insult, the shock, the response, how something meant to diminish ended up creating all of this." MJ smiled. "That's often how transformation works. Not through grand plans or strategies, but through moments of disruption that force us to see differently." She gestured toward Jakes, who was listening intently to an elderly man's story, his expression one of genuine engagement. "Look at him now. No performance, no audience to impress, just present with another human being." Across the room, Chuck Norris sat beside a woman in her 90s, her gnarled hands gesturing animatedly as she shared some story from her youth. His attention was complete, his presence fully engaged with her rather than his own image. "You know," MJ said thoughtfully, "in an industry obsessed with youth and novelty, with conflict and spectacle, this might be the most revolutionary act of all, creating space for wisdom to be heard, for dignity to be honored, for authentic connection to flourish away from the spotlight." What had begun with a shocking insult had evolved into something profoundly countercultural. A celebration of age rather than a dismissal of it, an embrace of quiet wisdom over loud certainty, of genuine connection over performed conflict. "Be quiet, old fart." The words that had once hung in the air as an insult had transformed into something entirely different. An invitation to listen to the voices our culture too often silences, to find strength in stillness, wisdom in years, and connection in authentic presence. And in that quiet transformation lay the true power of the story, not in the viral moment that had captured the world's attention, but in the human growth that followed, away from cameras and audiences, in the realm where real change always begins, in hearts open enough to learn, even from their own mistakes, and in the grace extended by those wise enough to recognize that behind every insult lies a human being capable of growth. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot